I mean, it's an understatement to say that this is disgusting and that it's horrific.
We now have details describing what police say was a daily dose of severe abuse at the hands of his adoptive parents, Jonathan and Christina Miranda.
It all started on a quiet street in northeast San Antonio that evening. In the driveway, a woman's desperate cries for help cut through the air as paramedics hurried toward the home. They vanished inside the front door, but in just a few minutes, the frantic pace slowed, and the atmosphere shifted from one of rescue to something much heavier. Then, two officers emerged, carrying a small black body bag, one clearly meant for a child. All conversation ceased, and the crying woman crumpled to the pavement once more, her voice shattering with disbelief. That night, nobody on Cielo Ranch Drive knew the child's identity or the depth of the suffering he had endured behind that door. They had no idea that inside that ordinary suburban house, a laundry room had been transformed into a place of confinement. By the following morning, the story had a name: 10-year-old Michael Miranda. And the couple who presented themselves as his parents, Jonathan and Christina Miranda, were gone from the home. Within hours, their names were circulating everywhere, not for charity, not for their adoption journey, but for a terrible accusation. Because the boy discovered lifeless in that house wasn't just another child needing help. Investigators claimed he had endured his final months in conditions they could barely put into words. And the question that haunted everyone who heard his name was this: how did two parents, who once promised a second chance through adoption, end up facing charges of capital murder? And what was the real story of what happened to Michael Miranda? But before we get into it, if you find this investigation compelling, please give this video a like when you're done, and let me know your thoughts on the case. It's a huge help for the channel. Drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video has been created strictly for educational and documentary purposes. It in no way endorses, glorifies, or condones any of the criminal activities or individuals detailed in this case. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. It was 9:22 p.m. on September 24th, 2025, when dispatchers directed San Antonio police and paramedics to 5600 Cielo Ranch Drive. The call reported a child who was not breathing. When the first responders pulled up, the house looked deceptively ordinary, with two cars in the driveway and the porch light on. Toys were scattered across the lawn. But the moment officers stepped inside, they knew something had gone horribly wrong. Down a short hallway, they discovered 10-year-old Michael Miranda lying on the floor of a narrow laundry room. He was completely still. His skin looked unnaturally pale, and his small body seemed frail, almost weightless in the arms of the paramedics. He was wearing a diaper, which was jarringly inappropriate for a boy his age, and his breathing was so shallow it was nearly undetectable. They started resuscitation efforts immediately, right there on the tiled floor, as another officer secured the room. One wall was lined with broken drywall, and the tile was marred with stains that told a grim story of their own. Near the washing machine sat a stack of worn pet pads, some of them used, arranged in a manner that implied this space had served a purpose far darker than its intended one. On the wall hung handmade charts filled with markers and stickers, which seemed to be tracking a child's daily behavior with a point system. Outside, a small cluster of neighbors had gathered, drawn out of their living rooms by the commotion and the flashing emergency lights. Among them was Christina Miranda, standing barefoot on the concrete driveway, her body racked with sobs. Inside, the paramedics kept fighting, calling out times and vital signs that only continued to drop. The lead medic finally glanced at the officer closest to him and gave a slow shake of his head. After several long, tense minutes, the effort stopped. 10-year-old Michael Miranda was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner was notified, and the home was officially a crime scene. Christina stayed on the ground while her husband, Jonathan Miranda, stood close by, completely silent, his face an unreadable mask. Detectives arrived shortly after and began the meticulous process of documenting everything. They photographed the laundry room from every possible angle, collected evidence from a trash bin, and sectioned off the damaged wall. What they saw didn't align with a sudden medical emergency. It looked more like a place where suffering had been a daily routine, because the evidence in that laundry room suggested Michael's death was anything but sudden. It had been escalating for months, hidden in plain sight right behind a closed door no one ever thought to open. Michael Miranda was 10 years old, small for his age, with dark hair, a shy smile, and the quiet disposition of a child who had already seen far too much. His adoptive mother, Christina Miranda, would often tell people that Michael came with a complicated history before he joined their family. She claimed they adopted him out of pure compassion, hoping to give him the stability he'd never had. And for a little while, to anyone looking in from the outside, it seemed like they had succeeded. Jonathan and Christina Miranda were known as a hard-working couple who appeared devoted to their family. They went to church every Sunday, were friendly with the neighbors, and frequently brought up the challenges of raising kids with difficult backgrounds. They had several children living at home, 4, maybe even 6, based on what reports would later uncover. And from the outside, their life looked completely ordinary. But the more police dug into the household, the more it became obvious that Michael's story didn't fit that narrative at all. Neighbors remembered seeing the Miranda children playing outside together, but not a single one could recall ever seeing Michael with them. One woman even said she had no idea another child lived in that house, until the night police cars swarmed the street. Michael's complete absence was one of the first red flags for investigators. There were no recent school records, no attendance logs, and no teachers who could comment on his behavior or academic progress. Every child in that home was homeschooled, and while that isn't unusual in itself, it meant very few adults outside the immediate family ever had any contact with him. So when detectives started to piece together the timeline of his final months, they had to rely on testimony from inside the home, and what they discovered contradicted almost everything the Mirandas had publicly claimed. According to the defense attorney the couple later hired, Michael suffered from severe behavioral problems linked to a brain tumor he'd had in the past. They argued he could be unpredictable, that he would sometimes slam his head against walls or become aggressive with others, and that the Mirandas were simply overwhelmed while trying to manage his complex medical and emotional needs. But investigators were looking at another possibility. They saw a child whose physical state, frail, weak, and withdrawn, didn't match the story of a boy who was just battling old health issues. As they dug deeper, they saw signs of prolonged isolation, not a medical relapse. They soon realized Michael's life inside that house had been rendered almost entirely invisible. There were no recent doctor's appointments on record after his adoption, no therapy notes, and 0 signs of any structured medical follow-up for his supposed brain condition. His world, by every account they could actually confirm, had shrunk to the confines of that small laundry room. Michael had been placed with the Mirandas for a chance at safety, but by the time investigators traced his story, the very home that was supposed to heal him had become the place where he vanished from the world. And while the Mirandas insisted they were just caring for a troubled child, the physical evidence, and what witnesses were about to reveal, would tell a far more sinister story. Once the initial on-scene documentation was complete, investigators shifted their focus to the parents. Jonathan and Christina Miranda were brought to the police station and placed in separate interview rooms. Jonathan was unnervingly calm, and when asked what happened to Michael that night, he gave a very simple response. He wanted a lawyer. From that moment on, he refused to answer any more questions. Christina's interview, however, started very differently. She appeared distraught, her voice shaking as she explained to detectives that Michael hadn't been feeling well. She said they had decided to keep him in the laundry room for a few days, to monitor him closely and to keep him from bothering the other children. But as the officers pressed her for specifics, asking exactly how long he'd been confined, when he had last eaten, or who was the last person to check on him, her answers started to fall apart. She hesitated constantly and offered conflicting timelines. Investigators quickly noticed that her version of events just didn't add up with what they'd witnessed inside the home. The laundry room clearly served as a long-term confinement space, evident from the built-up filth and the charts meticulously tracking weeks of behavior, along with the scuff marks on the door that hinted at constant use or even restraint. Absolutely nothing about that room suggested it was a temporary resting place for just a few days. When detectives presented Christina with these glaring inconsistencies, she immediately clammed up and then requested an attorney. With that, the interview was over, leaving investigators with far more questions than answers. As investigators began speaking with the other children, they knew this phase of the case would be decisive. The Miranda siblings were the only ones who had been inside that house long enough to reveal what truly happened to Michael. Each child was taken to a private room, accompanied by an investigator and a counselor. At first, none of them seemed ready to talk. It required patience and gentle reassurance before the first child finally began to speak. The accounts emerged slowly, jumbled at the start. But once the silence was broken, the other children started sharing their own recollections. What they revealed painted a portrait of horror that none of the detectives could have ever conceived. That single plea spoke volumes, telling investigators more than any piece of physical evidence could. It exposed a deep, pervasive fear, a fear of the consequences should their parents discover they had talked. The children confirmed that Michael had been confined to the laundry room for a very long time, far longer than the few days their mother had alleged. They recounted how he slept on the floor next to the washing machine and was forbidden to leave, except for trips to the bathroom or to do minor chores. But sometimes, they added, he wasn't even given that small mercy. He was made to face the wall for hours on end, his arms held high above his head until they shook uncontrollably. If his arms dropped, the punishment was repeated. The children detailed the various implements their parents used. At times a wooden paddle, other times a rubber one concealing a metal strip. When Michael cried out, they said, he was ordered to be silent, or the ordeal would only get worse. When detectives inquired about the frequency of these events, the children's response was chillingly uniform. Every single day. This wasn't discipline for a specific mistake, they explained. It was just their routine. The most trivial thing could trigger it. As the interviews progressed, the sustained and gone, was the interviews progressed, the children revealed that their parents would sometimes hoist Michael up by his feet and let him fall, in an effort to silence his crying. When he had an accident, he wasn't cleaned or changed. He was left in that state for hours, at times through the entire night. They reported the odor from the laundry room was so overpowering that the younger siblings avoided that part of the house, but they never dared to complain, because they had been explicitly warned never to speak of what went on in that room. Investigators noted that the children's testimonies corroborated each other perfectly and aligned with the evidence found at the scene. The puppy pads, the waste stains, the damaged drywall, and the behavior charts. Every child's story fit the timeline of injuries documented on Michael's body. Not a single one contradicted another. It was a stark revelation of the absolute control Jonathan and Christina Miranda wielded in their home. The children had been conditioned to equate suffering with discipline and to believe that their safety depended on their silence. Meanwhile, at the Bexar County Medical Examiner's office, the formal examination of Michael Miranda's body got underway. On the morning following his death, the same investigators who had stood in that grim laundry room now waited anxiously for official confirmation of what they already felt in their gut. For a brief moment, they held out hope that the reality was somehow less horrific than it seemed, but it was not. The autopsy confirmed every single fear the detectives had harbored since leaving that house. Michael was found to be severely underweight for his age, his small body bearing the unmistakable signs of chronic malnutrition. His ribs and bones revealed a history of repeated trauma. Both of his legs showed similar patterns of injury, and one of his arms hung at an unnatural angle, dislocated at the shoulder in a way that couldn't be explained by a simple fall. As the team pressed on with their examination, they uncovered more details that told a story of agony and endurance. Faint lines were visible across his torso, some fresh, others fading into memory. This wasn't the body of a child who succumbed to illness or a single, tragic accident. It was the body of a boy who had withstood repeated trauma, isolation, and starvation. Then, they made the discovery that explained his final moments. The examiner concluded that Michael's lower intestine had been ruptured. The tear had caused severe internal bleeding and a rapid infection that overwhelmed his system, making recovery impossible. Even if help had arrived sooner, this was the final blow, the one that claimed his life. But it was far from the first. The medical team determined it was likely caused by severe blunt force trauma to his abdomen, and the pattern of his internal damage perfectly matched what his siblings had already disclosed to investigators. When detectives received the formal report, they reconvened at the station late that afternoon. The lead investigator laid out the photos and autopsy summaries across the briefing table, while the rest of the team stood in grim silence. And, by the end of that week, affidavits were drafted and formally submitted to the district attorney's office. Each piece of evidence only strengthened the case, and by the morning of October 1st, 2025, arrest warrants were signed for Jonathan and Christina Miranda, charging them with capital murder of a person between 10 and 15 years old, the most severe charge possible under Texas law. That evening, a convoy of unmarked police vehicles rolled quietly down Cielo Ranch Drive. Jonathan emerged first, as officers ordered him to step outside. Christina trailed a few steps behind, clutching a sweater against her chest, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. At the Bexar County Jail, both Jonathan and Christina were booked and processed. Within hours, their mugshots were released to the public, showing each parent staring at the camera with the same weary, vacant expression. A judge reviewed the case overnight and set their bail at $1.5 million each, a figure that all but ensured they would remain behind bars until the trial. Outside, word had already started to spread. Reporters from local stations had gathered near the property. As the arrests unfolded, their cameras capturing the exact moment the couple was escorted into police cruisers. Within hours, headlines began to blaze across Texas. San Antonio parents charged with capital murder of adopted son.
Before we go, we want to get you to some breaking news. A married couple is facing charges of capital murder tonight. It comes after their 10-year-old adopted son died in their home last week. KENS 5's Vanessa Croy just heard from police and joins us live with the details. Vanessa?
Isis, what a tragic, devastating story that we just heard. These two parents, adoptive parents, are charged with capital murder in the death of their 10-year-old son, and officers believe the went on at least a year. Now take a look. This is 34-year-old Jonathan Miranda and 32-year-old Christina Miranda, both facing capital murder charges. Police tell us that on September 24th, around 9:22, officers went to the 5600 block of Cielo Ranch, that's on the northeast side, for reports of an unresponsive child. When they got there, EMS crews tried to save the child, but he did not survive his injuries. After investigators started looking into the case, they realized this child was a victim of continuous for at least a year. So right now, investigators say they are still trying to put together the pieces of what exactly happened. The medical examiner is now charged with finding a final determination of death. And before we go, Isis, we do want to say that they tell us there are other children in that home, and right now the investigation is ongoing to see if they were victims as
well. By October 2025, the case against Jonathan and Christina Miranda had moved into its next and most critical stage. Both remained in custody at the Bexar County Jail, held without release since their arrest a week prior. Each one faced a single but devastating charge: capital murder of a person between the ages of 10 and 15, a classification that could lead to life in prison without parole, or even the death penalty under Texas law. Meanwhile, the final autopsy report had still not been released to the public, and the complete Child Protective Services file, which likely holds critical details about the family's history, the adoption, and any prior investigations, is still tied up in legal review. At the same time, detectives are painstakingly combing through the family's electronics, phones, tablets, and computers seized from the house on Cielo Ranch Drive. Investigators were hoping to uncover records, messages, or online searches that could establish a timeline for how long Michael's abuse had been going on, or to see if either parent had documented it in any way. Forensic technicians worked meticulously, tracing login histories and digging into encrypted files, knowing that this digital evidence could either make the prosecution's case airtight or complicate it significantly. As the case inches forward, both sides are gearing up for a long and complicated legal fight, one that's expected to unfold slowly with months of evidence review, numerous hearings, and legal motions before a trial date can even be considered. And while the paperwork slowly grinds through the system, Michael's name hasn't faded from the public's mind, his story serving as a gut-wrenching reminder of what can happen when a child's suffering goes unseen for too long. What do you believe could have changed the outcome of this tragic case? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We read every single one, because every viewpoint matters. If this story affected you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending your time with us.